It is 6:12 p.m. No, how did I start? It is December 8th of December 2024, 6:13 p.m. There's two things I want to talk about today. I was watching was it Wendy Goon? What was this? Wendy Goon, yeah. This is like 9 hour iceberg of conspiracy theories. Although some were like already proven, or some are more like philosophies or perspectives, or they're like real things, but is extrapolated into the realm of um, more conspiracies. And I came, and then that watching, I didn't finish the video, but watching that so far has given me some ideas. Two ideas. The first two ideas. First one is regarding secret society, and I guess a power vacuum of secret society, which is proof that secret society would exist. I'll get into that in a bit. And the other one is about Mereological nihilism, and if quantum entanglement can disprove that. And first one is a lot simpler. So the idea that I was thinking is, there's a lot of conspiracies out there that maybe there's like reptilian people, or I don't know, CIA, FBI is behind the curtains doing something, or there's the Freemason or whatever. I'm not trying to prove that one of them actually exists, but the idea is there's a certain level of power one can achieve, one entity or organization or person can achieve by being in that position, right? And therefore, there is a sort of power vacuum for that role, to be behind the curtains, controlling, manipulating in some sort of way. So my idea is that there must be someone, if it's such a powerful position that is possible to exist, there must be someone that would take that position, whatever it is. There's a vacuum there, sort of. It's like in a what do you call it? In a society, monarchy, I guess, a monarchy, or any society really. If there is a king or governing power that goes missing, chances are someone will try to take that place, because that's such a powerful position. And it almost kind of functions naturally, that even if you don't want to, I don't want to, it's such an appealing position, and there's so many people out there that at some point or soon enough, there will be someone that will try to take that position. In the same way, the idea is, if there's no real secret society and all that, then it's such a powerful position that someone will soon enough take it anyways. So there must be one already existing, most likely. It's still a bit conspiracy-esque. Maybe I'm very terrible explaining, but that's the idea that there's a power vacuum of a secret governing power, and therefore a secret governing power is a very powerful position, which therefore creates a vacuum that attracts anyone who desires power to get into that position, or kind of needs that power. So it could be an already governing entity that wants to secure a more powerful position against other governing entities, and so on, stuff like that. I mean, at the same time, I guess secret society already kind of exists or something. I don't know. Well, I guess if they exist, then they're not a very good secret society, because they've been proven to exist. I don't know. But that's my take. The other one is about Mereological. I just learned. I read about it. I don't remember. I should read about it more. But Mereological nihilism, and can quantum entanglement disprove it? I was very fascinated by hearing Mereological nihilism, because when Wendigo explained it, I was like, oh wait, this is exactly what I explained when I was talking about cursive categorization. The idea that, you know, and this whole idea of nothing has inherent quality, like all objects are more or less assortments of its parts. And when you really keep digging, you get to the point where kind of everything is all the same. They're just assorted in a different way that creates the illusion that there are certain objects around you. But these objects are not really, the object itself. I mean, I think we put like inherentness to, for example, a cup. Inherentness to a cup, but a cup is simply an assortment of its parts, and therefore, and it's kind of hard to explain. Assortment of parts, and therefore, we're just categorizing that assortment of parts into what's known as cup. But the assortment doesn't really have an inherentness to it, I guess. And my ideas, especially considering the fact that the things that are get assorted are most likely more or less homogeneous to everything else. If you keep dividing into parts. If you really think about it, it becomes one big blend. Almost like a dotted painting, I would assume. But if you like keep zooming out, zooming in, I don't know how to visualize this metaphor. But at a certain point, when you keep Mereologically deciphering the world, if that makes sense, a dotted painting, which is a world, would just look like a painting with a dots that you cannot understand anything. Because that's how the world actually is. It's just a bunch of dots. But we're trained to categorize things in a certain way, that we draw a line around different dots and then say, oh, this is a cup, this is a phone. And often comes the circulation around the dots come in the form of functionality, or our way of categorizing items based on its it could be its color, or the sense of unity that this seems like one object that is not connected to this object. They also look very different. So therefore, these two are inherently different items. But then you take away the filter and you'll just see dots. But dots as a metaphor. As just parts. I guess quarks. I don't know. I don't know physics that much, but I think the idea, it's my idea, that when you go deep enough, everything is made out of the same thing. Maybe I'm wrong. Then that kind of maybe questions everything. But then that's kind of my idea. Mereological nihilism is more or less the same. I mean, I only did like preliminary reading. But it's the same idea that things are made out of parts and everything is sort of an assortment of its parts, but nothing is really the object it is. Which really sounds like what I'm thinking. But yeah, I mean that's what I think. Part. I feel like I explained it better before. I haven't gone back to this idea in a while, so maybe I forgot something crucial regarding this. To be fair, my point was more to do with how we are kind of cursed with meaning making, that we always want to put meaning into stuff. But anyways, and then mereological nihilism, or my idea that's basically mereological nihilism, is going against our tendency to put meaning into things. But then here comes this thing called quantum entanglement, which I'm not a physicist. Physicist, yeah. So I'm not 100% sure I really understand. And once again, preliminary reading. But what I understand is at a quantum level, two sets of particles, I guess electrons, can have a sort of correlated connection where if one is spinning one way, the other one will correspondingly spin the opposite way. Which, first of all, I don't understand. Like, top spinning down? What is that? Like, top spin, bottom spin, was it? Does that mean, like, one is clockwise and the other one is anti-clockwise? I don't even know. And it gets more confusing because electrons are in are electrons in a superposition? Or the idea is that you can't really identify the position of an electron. So that makes it really... Oh, but I guess spinning is already pointing to sort of the not necessarily the location of the electron, but sort of the velocity, kind of the direction that it's moving. So it's not really the position anyways. But point is that there's some sort of connection, but it isn't communication. And the metaphor that I read, which I don't know how true it is, it was just on Reddit, is that two people share a hat. If one person is wearing a hat, and you meet the other person who isn't wearing a hat, given that they would always try to wear the hat, um, immediately you can understand that the other person would be wearing a hat. Which the metaphor makes sense, but I don't understand how that could be applied in the actual context. Because I just don't understand physics. But the idea is that there is a sort of connection, and you have to identify two particles as kind of one single object. Which then, isn't that kind of a bedrock of Mereology, or Mereological nihilism? The idea that you can't really break down these electrons even more to its parts, because then you miss the whole part where they have this weird connection that goes beyond space and time. I don't know about time, but beyond space. Maybe. But then I feel like, but isn't that the same as possibly any other connection? Like, like magnets or glue sticking on a paper. You stick the paper on a, what do you stick a paper on a board? Isn't that defying Mereological nihilism? And then I would say no, that's not really. So then I'm wondering why I thought of this. Because just because they have a connection, I guess I identify a sort of inherentness to the connection of quantum entanglement. But then just because it's so subatomic, it doesn't have to be inherent. It just seems inherent. Maybe that's the thing. So it doesn't disprove Mereological nihilism. Maybe. Or maybe it's the idea that they could be so separate spatially, but have a connection. Because if you think about it, like on a dotted painting, these two dots will always have like a line drawn. But I don't know if that's going way too abstract and using metaphors that it becomes not that practical. I don't know. Or maybe the whole, my idea that is basically Mereological nihilism is a sham. That anything with some sort of connection has inherentness to it. Does that make sense? I don't know. Yeah. I mean, I still don't think things have inherent quality, or maybe I should think of another word than quality. Inherentness to it. Inherent ontology. Maybe that's a better word. Is there inherent such thing as inherent ontology? A thing can be just itself. and I don't think that's true on a physical level through Mereology, but also semiotically. For the most part, you can't identify an object without relation to other objects as well, which goes to theories of Sejourian semiotics or something. I don't remember. That was like 2-3 years ago. But my point is, what is my point? My point is I should read more. But it's interesting that I came across Mereological nihilism and its relation to quantum entanglement. Although as I'm speaking, I'm thinking maybe quantum entanglement doesn't really disprove it, because you could just say it's like any other connection or any other form of entanglement in the context of Mereology. Maybe. Although, then what's entangling it, right? If it's not like an actual particle or some, is it an energy that's entangling it? I don't know. So then I think the question I need to ask myself is, what makes something inherently, when can I define, what defines as inherently ontological? Or is it ontologically inherent? I can't even figure out which one goes where. Inherently ontological would mean something is related to ontology inherently. So it's probably wrong. Ontologically inherent. Fuck, I'm getting that weird phenomenon. Inherent. Yeah. Essentialism. Inherent. Ontologically inherent is its existence is its existence-ness is inherent, right? So ontological inherent. So the question I have to myself is, what makes something ontologically inherent? Which I probably could, if I'm really reading ontology and studying that, I could probably already answer that. Which is probably going to be convoluted anyways, with no real answer, but I don't know. Well, let me try to think for a bit if I can define, because my first definition would be something akin to an axiom, that it's kind of a bedrock of understanding something. There's almost an intuitiveness to it, but I guess in terms of ontology, it would go into the realms of physics. So my understanding is what's more subparticular. I don't know words. What is smaller than quarks? I don't know. So quarks might seem ontologically inherent to me, that they exist as quarks because they are quarks and they're not made out of anything else. But I don't think that's true. And I'm not sure if that really makes something really inherently itself, just because it's not made out of anything else. But, well, if it isn't made out of anything else, wouldn't it be inherently itself? I think. On a physical level, once again, on a semiotic level, I don't think it's really possible, except my guess is it's only possible because we have an inherent understanding of certain things, or there's some sort of mechanism that I don't know, some sort of mechanism during infant development where you can learn without knowing it, if that's even possible. I think there's supposed to be some level of intuition, right? Because without intuition, how can you learn it? But then that intuitive knowledge has to have come from something before, or no? Well, probably the intuitive knowledge or understanding was probably something random that happened to correspond to the relative truth, or randomly happened to help us understand enough of something that we can utilize the functionality. And that became the first intuitive knowledge. It's just randomly happened to be correct. That would be my guess at a certain point in evolution. And then from there, we build intuitive knowledge into knowledge that we can understand through relative relations to other knowledge. Well, this is all theoretical. Maybe I don't understand something very important about science, psychology, or maybe this is a realm that hasn't really been explored. I have no clue. But yeah, I'll think about that. But going back to what makes something inherently itself, ontologically inherent. That's all I can think of, that it is made of itself only, or it doesn't have a part. Because I would think if it's made of itself, technically there's like a sub level of itself, right? Sub level of itself. But at that stage, I think how things work is different, right? Just because something, I would assume, just because something is a part of something else does not, maybe it doesn't make it smaller than what it makes of, or the whole, if that's even possible. I don't know. That doesn't make any sense. And I don't know physics, so maybe I'm just writing science fiction now. But something of a whole. But assume if a whole minus a percentage of itself still equals 0, would that make it still, would that make itself inherent? I don't know. But that's all I can really think of what makes something inherently ontological. Well, I guess one would be if it was made, if it has nothing, if it's not made from anything but itself. It's like the smallest unit of its object, then isn't its inherent property to be the smallest unit of object? But then I feel like that's still us putting meaning into it, because we're put the understanding that things are built from a large scale to a small. Things are built from a large scale. No, things are built by a smaller part of itself. So we go through that thread, and whatever is the smallest would make it itself kind of axiomic physically. But then that's still kind of putting an identity in an object through that lens of how things are built by sum of smaller parts. Basically, just because something doesn't have smaller parts to make it into a whole, that its whole thing is one thing and no smaller parts exist, why would that make it inherently its ontology? That it's the subunit of everything. Isn't that still us defining our understanding, our perspective onto it? It's still a projection of how we categorize things, how we put meaning. Right? But then if that's the case, what makes me say that a table isn't an object because it's made out of smaller parts of other objects? No, it's made out of parts that are smaller than the whole. And then there's layers that repeat that. Because the whole argument for me that's basic in Mereological nihilism is something doesn't have inherent quality because if you really see it at the most subunit of what makes something a whole, everything is homogeneous, and therefore they're just simply these parts arranged in a certain way, right, to create the illusion that things are distinct. But then that's also kind of different. I don't think that's really exactly Mereological nihilism, right? Because my argument hinges on homogeneity at the most bedrock unit of a particle. Right, so I don't think it matters if the last unit the smallest unit of a particle is made up of itself only as a whole. It's indivisible, I think. It doesn't matter. But then I put meaning into this sort of nihilism. I can define nihilism because there's meaning in those dots in a painting. So then wouldn't... But my point is nihilistic towards defining objects that we normally define. But maybe it's not nihilistic towards an object that builds all these other objects. Maybe at a sub-unit level I can't make the same argument. I'm just gonna... I'm using all these descriptions to instead of using actual nouns. So I'm just gonna say quarks, because I only know quarks as the smallest unit. So let's say quarks is, in this case, the smallest unit possible. It's not made out of any other units. I don't think that's really true, but in this context, let's say it's quarks. I'm repeating myself, but my whole idea is that quarks are homogeneous, and therefore, if you really think about everything, they're just quarks aligned in certain ways to create the illusion that certain objects are objects with its own unit, and therefore they seem inherent when they're not really. They're just quarks aligned in a certain way. And therefore, when you kind of zoom out, it looks like a dotted painting that you can't really see anything clearly. But then the question is, okay, but we can still see the dots in the dotted painting, right? And we put sort of meaning into the dots in the dotted painting by calling it a dot. And we use the indecipherableness of the entire picture based on the idea that there are dots, but dots are just aligned. But if we take away the meaning from dots, how do I take meaning away from dots? I don't know. So then, does something have meaning inherently? Or maybe at that or maybe my idea that one idea is can universally apply to everything is wrong. Maybe. But then if I apply different philosophies or different arguments to prove like nihilism in categories and objects, the fact that I'm changing means that if there's a difference, and therefore there's some level of inherent difference as well, right? I don't know. But then I think my hmm, hmm. Hmm. But also, my argument isn't. I don't think it's technically really mereological nihilism. So that's also the confusion there. Hmm. Well, okay, I'm gonna stop it there because I think there's no. I don't think I can get to a conclusion, at least for now. Maybe I'll sleep on it. Uh, but one possible argument for now is that if something could have ontological inherentness, uh, it's if there are no smaller parts making it. That's one. The other way something can have ontological inherentness is if a creator, I guess, has put meaning into an object. Um, which means if you're religious or agnostic, or if you believe in, I don't know, panpsychism or some sort of reality that there's already some level of non-nihilism. And then that power, I guess, if that power imbues meaning into an object, I would say there is inherentness to that object. Right. I think. And what's interesting about these powers is, for the most part, you can't Mereologize. I'm really playing around with this word when I really don't know too much about it. But you can't Mereologize that power for I think most religions. You can't say, oh, how is God made in Christianity? No, God is just God. So I think that's a really fascinating argument against Mereology. I don't know if it's argument against, but I guess a contrasting force against Mereology. Or world, maybe. Not necessarily force, but worldview. That something could not be made out of something else. I would assume. God is just God. It's not. Is there parts? But then. But then, I mean, like, that's why I could start arguing about how religion doesn't really exist and make all these kind of more logical arguments kind of disproves this whole thing. But my second point of how ontological inherentness is possible is given that there are these theological powers or some sort of creator or center of the universe or something that imbues meaning into something. But then my question would be, okay, what if it's kind of like a simulation? What if the world is a simulation and whoever created the simulation put meaning into, let's say, a human? The humans are created for the purpose of being human in this simulation. Would that make it also would that make humans inherently human? Because I think that the reason why I'm posing this question is because an entity that created a simulation is a bit different from a god, although they would be in almost a godlike position. They're not necessarily almighty, right? And still imposes a sense of nihilism to the world. The world doesn't have any meaning, although it was created for a purpose, that purpose being whatever the purpose of the simulation is. So then, my head hurts. Oh, it doesn't really hurt, but so simulation. Well, in one way, I could argue that even in a simulation context, something that's imbued meaning by the creator of the simulation could have inherent meaning, right? Inherent ontological inherentness, because it was sort of created for that purpose. It was created for, it exists because it was inherently created. By the same thing that created the universe itself. But then the question is, when us humans also create something, we do have an intention behind a lot of our creations. So we imbue meaning into whatever we create. So therefore, isn't there a lot of parallel between that? How is it really different? Because if the creator of the simulation created humans for the purpose of humans, how is that different from humans creating a chair for the purpose of a chair? Wouldn't they both have ontological inherentness? I don't know. Well, but then the other argument is, if it's a simulation, just simply that the object would still not have inherent, ontological inherentness, because of the argument I just gave. Because it's the simulation theory could still impose nihilism. And I guess the person imbuing meaning could still be made out of a sum of smaller parts. But what if they're made out of sum of smaller parts that are different from our world? But if this is a simulation, our simulation would still be utilizing matters from our creator's world, I guess. and therefore still be utilizing the same quark or the smallest subunit. Therefore, we are all. There's no inherent ontological inherentness. And then, of course, the other argument is if the smallest subunit is homogeneous, not homogeneous, then that would kind of disprove my argument, I feel. Does it? I don't know if that's really my point of my argument. Or maybe that my argument wasn't that as well thought out to begin with. Could be. Or that maybe I should not argue this sort of my version of Mereological nihilism based on physics, but more so just semiotically. But the fascinating thing is it can still go back to physics, or maybe it doesn't go back all the way to physics, but at least biology, because the question is, where did the first knowledge come from? Right. Which is before we evolved into humans. Way before. From, I guess, how does the first thought happen, right? When does it go from instinct to consciousness? But then I don't think we've answered that. So until that question gets answered, I would argue that things don't have inherent... but would that even matter? Oh, but it would matter, because the first knowledge, the way first knowledge is brought about would determine if that first knowledge has inherent quality, which I would argue probably really doesn't. And it's my theory is it's evolutionarily coincidental that the first knowledge was simply evolutionarily correct, that whatever first knowledge was, that it worked well at keeping the species surviving, reproducing. But then, is the idea of there was a first knowledge even correct? Or maybe it was like a collection of knowledge. I don't know. Or maybe it's kind of answered during infant development. That I don't know. I didn't study infant psychology or neurology. Not that much. I don't know. This was like almost an hour of me just arguing about crazy stuff. So I'll try to summarize. So today, first I talked about simply that a secret organization probably exists because it is a powerful position that if they don't exist, there's a power vacuum which would attract those who want and those who need or desire that power. And considering how many people organizations are capable, I would assume, especially government organizations, they would probably be able to fill in that vacuum easily, and therefore a secret organization probably does exist. God, I just think about like all these other arguments, but I'll move on for now. My other point was, first of all, what is Mereological nihilism? From my understanding, it stems from Mereology, which is a philosophy that dabbles in looking at an object and seeing it as a whole of smaller parts. No, seeing an object as a sum of smaller parts that often have that those smaller parts are also a sum of even smaller parts. That keeps going on, but that's not necessarily the main point of the theory. But the philosophy is more about looking at the world through things have parts, things make a whole, and so on. And I need to read more into it. And then nihilism, that nothing has inherent meaning. Combine that, Mereological nihilism is saying that not in terms of the context of objects, physical objects, I guess I would assume abstract objects as well. They are not really itself because there are parts that assemble into itself. And then there's quantum entanglement that from my very non-physicist preliminary understanding is that there are two quantum particles that have a certain correlating connection that is connected even when they are billions of light years apart, although it's not a communication connection. They just have some sort of inherent correlation. And my question was, does that inherent correlation disprove this Mereological nihilism? Because it's sort of Mereological nihilism, I think, in a sense, points to the idea that things are random, right? Things are sorted in a certain way, but we're defining that assortment when assortment really is random. But then quantum entanglement comes along and says the assortment isn't random because look, there's some sort of physical inherent connection. But then I come along and I think to myself, wait, I wanted to talk about Mereological nihilism because it sounds very similar to this whole cursive categorization thing I talked about before. But maybe it's a little different, mostly because I haven't really read too much about Mereological nihilism. But at least my point related to, Mereological nihilism is that it comes in two ways. That the Mereology, or not Mereology, but when you keep dividing objects, you get to a level where everything becomes sort of homogeneous. And that when you look at it from that lens, you don't see the division between the objects we see from our day-to-day. And that division comes mostly because of how we have learned to categorize things. We learn to put meaning into things. But that homogeneity kind of brings about taking away meaning. And then from a semiotic level, we could also say that the meaning of objects, meaning of ideas even, are made up of relation to other ideas or other meanings. And therefore, it of itself doesn't really have like an inherent meaning. It cannot stand on its own. It's a sum of other meanings. And I guess that's the whole point of Mereological nihilism, but also my point. That's basically Mereological nihilism, is that nothing is inherent because it's always made up of other things. There's nothing inherent about something that is not made just by itself, I think. And then I went on a rant about, okay, what actually is something that's inherently itself. And then the first thing I thought is, okay, the most smallest unit of a particle, if it's made of itself, because it's the smallest unit, does that make it inherently itself? My answer is, I don't know. I think the easiest thing would be that we don't actually have a smallest unit of object. That would be much easier. The other argument I put is, we can say something is inherently itself if there is a creator or there is a power that is sort of takes the role of a god. And therefore, if it is a god, it can imbue inherentness to objects if it does so. And I guess also another reason something could inherently, ontologically be inherent is if the smallest subunits are different. And that there's no homogeneity, that objects have different subunits which makes them unique, and therefore there's I don't know if that makes it really inherently itself, but at least there's a sense of uniqueness that if inherent and non-inherent, I don't know the antonym of inherent, but if inherent and non-inherent was a spectrum, then if the smallest subunits were heterogeneous and different objects had different subunits, wouldn't that make it a little unique, different? Therefore there's some level of, you would move it towards a bit to inherent more than non-inherent, because there's less randomness. Although now that I'm thinking, wouldn't just how things are aligned differently be unique as well? Because in a world of quantum physics, maybe it's not necessarily the particle, but how the particles are aligned, what makes it unique, maybe. And I'm gonna start going into a whole thing. So yeah, I don't know what I'm really thinking, but I feel like that's kind of the conclusion. Although a lot of the conclusion I just gave is adding new ideas to what I have been talking about, but that's what I'll put. But I think the main point with Mereological nihilism here is, how can something have inherent how can something be ontologically inherent when it's made out of something else, and something else has their own meaning, sort of, but those something else are also not inherent, right? Now, how can something have inherent meaning when itself is not made by itself? I think. And the argument I didn't even bring up today is that just because something is made by itself for a purpose doesn't mean you can't use it for another way. That's nothing. You can use a chair as a table, for example, a cup as a decoration, a phone as a weight, etc. It muddles its main purpose, I guess. I think maybe also using the word meaning is not the best terminology here. Maybe I should have said purpose. But then that's also why I use quality to begin with. Oh, but I didn't really say meaning or quality. I said ontology, right? Its existence is inherent of itself. If it spawned, I would say it's also possibly not an object that is not mereologically nihilistic. Although mereologically nihilistic is probably more of a worldview than describing an object, but I think you could kind of separate it per object, because the world might change per object. if they have different properties, maybe. I don't know. Okay, that's it. Long ass video.